So now I think people should be beginning to arrive. If anybody has arrived in the session, perhaps they could let me know by typing in the chat. Hello, hello. Great to have you with us. Good, lots of names beginning to appear. So that's a great sign. Just a quick reminder, you can use the chat, of course, to ask questions. So if you can keep typing your questions throughout the session, then we'll do our best to pick up on as many of those as possible later on. I'll just give people a couple more minutes to arrive. We have a main speaker and also a local case study for you. So lots to get through. We won't delay proceedings too much. Very warm welcome to everybody. Now we will begin the session. And I'd like to say thank you for attending this session on planting for pollinators in an urban setting. I'm delighted to introduce to you Professor Jane Memmott from the University of Bristol. And Jane lives and breathes pollinators. She has a degree, a PhD, and around 30 years experience. And today Jane's going to draw mainly on the Urban Pollinator Project that's informed multiple programmes across the UK, including our own partnership project at College Green. And without further ado, I'll pass over to Jane.
Okay, it's fantastic to, I can't quite see you out there, but I know there's people out there. So let me share my screen. Ooh, wrong one. Good start. Share screen. Application. Done. Right, I'm just going to slideshow and then we're ready. Right, so what I'm talking about is planting for pollinators, small parks and gardens. And I'm Professor Jane Memmott from the University of Bristol. And this is my brief. This is what I was asked to talk about. So I'm going to tell you for the first kind of half of the talk about the Urban Pollinator Project, which is one of the biggest, most exciting projects I've ever run. I'm going to give you an overview of research that actually doesn't focus on wildflower meadows, some other types of research, and kind of do 6 fun facts about pollinators and plants in urban habitats. We'll then have a look at a kind of an overview of the recommended species and the wildlife they support, focusing on pollinators, and then kind of winding up with what can realistically be achieved in small spaces with the kind of 6 top tips for success with pollinators. And then I'll just briefly mention a couple of ongoing research projects at Bristol that are running at the moment. So starting off with the Urban Pollinators Project. So this was what's called a consortium project. So there were 4 universities involved, so working with colleagues at Reading, Leeds and Edinburgh University. We ran this project called the Urban Pollinators Project. It was led by Bristol and it's working in collaboration with other academics, with conservation practitioners in all 4 cities. So these are the people that kind of buy and manage nature reserves. They do the practical, really important work on the ground. And then a team of taxonomists at the National Museum of Wales who did all the identification of the pollinators for us. And this was it was a £1.3 million insect pollinator initiative. And this was it's actually, the fund was 10 million quid. And it was to look at all the woes that were affecting pollinators in the UK. So pesticides and agricultural intensification and disease. And we got the urbanisation slot. So a big, exciting project. And just starting off with a little bit of background, some of the things we know about pollinators in urban habitats. So we know they can be reasonable habitats for pollinators. So for example, half of all the bee species found in Germany can be found in the city of Berlin. So one German city has half of the bee species in the whole country. If you look here in Britain, looking at Birmingham, honeybees produce more honey in urban Birmingham than in the surrounding countryside. Okay, so that suggests there's more flowers in the city than in the countryside. And then a study from Leicester, 35% of British hoverfly species were found in a single Leicester garden. And hoverflies are up there with, it's not just bees that are pollinators. There's beetles, there's flies, butterflies, and so on. And 35% of British hoverfly species in this one garden. And this was a pretty special garden, actually. This is Jennifer Owen's garden. There's 2 books on this garden, one on the first 15 years and then a 30-year study. It is almost certainly the most well-studied garden in the UK. And it's actually, I've got a picture of it here. It's actually it's a reasonable sized garden, but it's not like a special wildlife garden. This is a reasonably standard British medium-sized garden. And in that garden, over 30 years, she recorded 2,673 species, okay? So 474 plants, 375 moths, and so on. So gardens can be really rich and diverse in terms of wildlife. Looking specifically at the Urban Pollinator Project, 2 of the questions we were asking. First one was, where exactly is pollinated biodiversity in the UK? Is it in urban habitats, farmlands, or nature reserves? And there hadn't been a systematic survey until the point of this project. And then secondly, if you look at a single urban habitat, those 4 cities, where are the hotspots for pollinator biodiversity in cities? How good are those parks and gardens, for example, that we're going to be talking about today? So in that first field season, what we did was sample 12 cities, 12 farms and 12 nature reserves. And in each of those places, all 36 sites, we had a plot that was a kilometre square. And then we sampled that very systematically. The cities were close to the 4 universities that were involved. So we got a bunch in Scotland, north of England, south of England and west of England. And they go from Dundee to Southampton to Cardiff. So they're representative of cities in the UK overall. And this is us. This is Reading. I can tell by the people rather than the road verge. This is the Reading team surveying a road verge in Reading. This is the northern team in a nature reserve somewhere in the north of England. And then this is the Reading team in a rural habitat. So we're sampling the plants and the pollinators very systematically. And this is one of the key results. There's actually significantly more bee species in cities than in the surrounding farmland. Okay, so cities can be really rather good for pollinators. Then if we home in on the second question about the hotspots of pollinator biodiversity in cities, and how do gardens and parks rate versus other habitats? This is a bit of Bristol, okay? Bristol is actually kind of like a smorgasbord of different types of habitats. You've got gardens and parks, but you've also got road verges, cemeteries, urban nature reserves, allotments, other green space, which is everything that's kind of green and grassy, but not any of the above categories. You've got man-made surfaces, or the boring concrete, railways, roads, pavements, and water bodies. Those make up cities. And we sampled all of those habitats very systematically, with the exception of water, because there's no aquatic pollinators, and roads and railways because health and safety kind of considerations. They're too dangerous to sample. And there's not many pollinators on roads at all. And railways are a tiny proportion of cities. So this is how we did it. In all 4 cities, we did a total of 2,160 100-metre transect walks. So these are where we actually collect the plants and the pollinators. We sampled nearly 8,000 flower visiting insects of 390 different species identified by our taxonomists. We had 641 plant species, and we counted a ridiculous number of flowers in the 4 cities. And if you look at the overall results, what we've got here are all of the different habitats, allotments, gardens, and cemeteries, and so on, and then a mean richness per unit area. So we're comparing comparable, but exactly the same amount of land in each habitat. And you can see that allotments and gardens are the best. And if you look at the 2 we're particularly interested in, gardens and parks, gardens are in the top, up there with allotments, and parks are kind of somewhere in the middle. They're not that wonderful, actually, for pollinators, parks in the 4 cities. But per unit area, just to repeat that, actually, per unit area of habitats, gardens are very good and parks are relatively poor in comparison. Now, this is rather interesting. This was actually a surprise to us. If you look at the habitats cities are made up of, our 4 cities were remarkably uniform. So what you've got here is the proportion by city area here, and then all of these different habitats. And gardens are about 1/4 to 1/3 of all 4 cities, okay? Pretty consistent. The other big habitat is this other green space. And this is a multitude of different owners, and it's all the stuff that's not parks or nature reserves or allotments or verges. There's an awful lot of this kind of leftover green space outside of, you know, residential housing and churches, and they're just scattered around. Parks are about 5% of the area, and so on. So that's what the cities look like. What you can actually do now is, because you know how many pollinators are per unit area of habitat, and you know the area of each habitat in the city, you can multiply the area of each habitat in the city by the number of pollinators, and that will tell you where pollinators are in a city. And this is fun to look at. So let me take you through this next graph. So this is predicting how many pollinators are in which habitats based on the information from all our sampling. So starting off with gardens. Gardens are a quarter to a third of each city, and they're very, very good for pollinators. So most pollinators in cities are found in gardens. So our own little, effectively, I think of my garden as my own little private nature reserve. You know, it's not very big, but it's pretty special and it's mine. And you know, so most pollinators are in gardens. Allotments were equally good for pollinators, but they're about 1% of the area of cities. So it's a very small area. It's very good for pollinators, but at the city scale, it contributes rather little. But it's got a huge potential. If we had more allotments, we'd have more pollinators and a lot more happy gardeners as well, actually. Allotments are good for people as well as pollinators. Parks have huge potential because they're not that great at the moment, but they could be much better. We'll come back to that. And then the really huge area for potential, this other green space, it's a very large area and it's very bad for pollinators at the moment. So if we did something, you know, not even that great with other green space, it could make a big difference. So gardens are important and parks are a huge opportunity. And there's me in my first ever garden. Our first gardens are really very, very special to us. It was a teeny tiny little terrace backyard, but I still think back very fondly on that first garden. But you can kind of see why parks aren't that great for pollinators. There's not much floral diversity in that park. It's green. And you know, there's a lot we can do with parks. And these habitats are, you know, they're important habitat for things like bees. And there's 25 species of bumblebee in the UK and about 250 species of solitary bee. So a lot of diversity there. So moving to the next part of the talk, an overview of research that I was specifically asked not to focus on wildflower meadows. So I'm going to take you through 6 fun facts about pollinators and mostly urban things. So starting off with bumblebee nests, because each bumblebee you see it has its home nest where the queen lives and all the workers are based. Gardens are remarkably good for bumblebee nests. There was a citizen science project run by Julia Osborne, who's now Exeter University, and she had 719 volunteers in the UK as part of a citizen science project, and they measured bumblebee nest density. And gardens have 36 nests per hectare on average, whereas woodland and grassland has, I think, it's 11 to 15 nests per hectare. So gardens can be quite good sites for bumblebee nests, and I always feel particularly honoured when I have a bumblebee nest in our garden. Gardens can actually help farmland pollinators too, from our own research. If you've got gardens nearby, you have a higher bumblebee colony density in agricultural landscapes. So something like this, where you've got some rural gardens, the pollinators in those gardens, the bumblebees in particular, they'll come into the gardens to forage and kind of top up on nectar. So gardens actually help surrounding rural areas. So this is some work we published last year. Fact 3, gardening and conservation volunteer is really good for you. So this is about you as kind of friends of parks and gardeners and things. And just a couple of bits of research. So this is work by Woods et al. At the University of Essex. And they actually looked at allotment gardener health and well-being. And they found that compared to the normal population, allotment gardeners have significantly better self-esteem and general health. They experience less depression and fatigue and apparently more vigour. So that's allotment gardeners. And if you just extend that to volunteering, if you're a member of a friends group or something like that, this is work done by the wildlife trusts, and they had a 12-week study period, and participants reported feeling significantly enhanced feelings of positivity and, improved general health 12 weeks into a volunteering program. So this is a win-win sort of situation. This is something which is really good for the environment if you're volunteering, and also it's really good for you personally. So I absolutely adore win-win scenarios, and this is an absolute classic one. Fact 4, gardens actually provide the vast majority of nectar in cities, We've had two big projects in my research group where we actually measure the amount of nectar in different plant species. We started off doing wild plant species, so the 260 wild plants that give you 99% of the cover in the UK, because although there's actually several thousand plant species in the UK, only a small number of them are very common. So we looked at those first of all, and then a couple of years ago we added 536 garden species. And what we found was when we look at our 4 cities, Bristol, Reading, Leeds and Edinburgh, 85% of the nectar in the 4 cities is found in gardens. Parks actually only provided an average of 4% in the 4 cities. So again, there's a real opportunity to get more nectar into parks. Fact 5, size doesn't matter, actually. Garden size doesn't matter. You don't need to have a big garden to make a difference. Large gardens were not better than small gardens in a study we did, a really intensive study of 60 gardens in Bristol, going from the very big to the very small. What we did find was that nectar production was higher in more kind of affluent, more richer neighbourhoods. And we were able to get that information from using the census data, actually. Census data is available to the public, actually. So we were able to work that out. But actually, it's interesting. You could fix that. You know, you can certainly find budget-friendly gardening. A few packs of seeds would go a long way there to upping the value of lower income areas in terms of nectar. And then finally, the countryside is actually in trouble. Okay, so if you look at the extinction rates and all the problems facing the countryside, the project we did on the first project on nectar, we've lost nearly 1/3 of nectar in the countryside since the 1950s and the intensification of agriculture. And of what's left, 50% of that comes from just 4 species of plant. So from erica, heather, white clover and marsh thistle. So if any of those plants, gets got by some plant disease or something, that would take out a lot of the remaining nectar. So urban areas provide a real conservation opportunity for pollinators. And that's something, most people live in urban areas. So it's something where we can all make a difference. It's quite difficult to do something personally to help pandas or tigers or whales, but we could all do something to help the pollinators on our patch. Even if you just got a doorstep, put a pot with flowering herbs in there or lavender or something like that. So moving on to the third section of the talk, an overview of the most recommended species and the pollinators they actually support. So what we're doing here is we're asking what are the best, and because we can do that, we can also ask what are the worst plants for pollinators. And you might think, well, that's kind of been done. There's all these lists out there, and this is what a quick Google found me, top flowers for bees, trees for bees, the RHS scheme and so on. And there are a bunch of these kind of information sets out there. But one of the issues is these aren't kind of evidence-based. These are based on kind of observations in people's gardens. A bunch of people kind of go into a huddle and come up with a list of things they think are good for pollinators. And it's not that they're wrong, but as a scientist, I actually like to see a really good evidence base for things. And so what we had was this amazing evidence, kind of this data set consisting of, 2,000 odd sampling occasions, 8,000 insects, 741 plant species, and so on, across 4 different cities in the UK. So using that data set, we were able to kind of come up with some plants that were evidence-based, really good for pollinators. But first of all, we've got to define what best means. What does best for pollinators actually mean? So how do you define what is best? You could just say, well, it's a plant that's visited a lot in the garden, and that's kind of probably where a lot of the previous lists have come from. But that could just be a common plant. And a plant that's common is always going to be more visited because there's a lot of them, so you see more visitors on them. Our definition was rather different. What we said best meant was that plants that are visited much more often than you would expect based on their abundance, okay? So plants that seem to act as bee magnets, even when they're rare, they're the ones that the pollinators, not just bees, actually all pollinators visit. And these are referred to as keystone plants. And a keystone anything in a community is a species that is disproportionately important to that community. So we did some industrial strength statistics to actually kind of work out what are the keystone plants in our data set from the 4 cities. And this is what we found. So I'm going to give it's the top dozen basically, and we've got the garden plants and the native plants, because actually there's an awful lot of native plants growing in cities. So in parks and nature reserves, and as weeds on pavements and all sorts of places, there are a lot of native plants. So we looked at both sides. So starting with the garden plants, the top 6 are borage, buddleia, marigold, lavender and comfrey. So all of these are easy to grow. In fact, it's quite hard stopping buddleia growing in some ways. It'll seed into your garden forever. Borage, marigold and comfrey can all be grown fairly easily from seed. Lavender takes easily from cuttings. So these are things that you can put into your garden, and you know that you've got some of the top 6 plants that are pollinator magnets. If you look at the native plants, it's rather interesting. At the top, you've got creeping thistle, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But creeping thistle, woodhaven, hogweed, cat's ear, which is a dandelion type plant, and oxeye daisy. And you might think, well, oh, actually, I'm not sure I want those in my garden. And, you know, creeping thistle is a sort of plant that farmers hate. It's a perennial weed. But if you think about it and just think a little bit laterally, there's creeping thistle down there, the pale pink one. But there's actually a closely related species from, I think it's from the States, actually, Cirsium rivuleri. And this is one of those kind of, you know, really kind of fashionable plants right now, and it is unbelievably good for pollinators. So if you don't want creeping thistle in your garden, which is fair enough, I'm not that keen on having it in the garden either, but go and get yourself some Cirsium rivuleri, because that will be absolutely smothered in pollinators, particularly bumblebees love it. So you can look at kind of some of the, you know, the garden versions of some of these, you know, some of the weeds, but I have oxeye daisy in the garden for sure, and I'll take you through some other native plants in a moment. So the worst plants, of course, we can go to the other end of the scale. And rather interestingly, Limnanthes poached eggplant came out as really bad in the 4 cities, despite being one labelled by the RHS. Daisy isn't, there's gazillions of daisies in cities. You very rarely see pollinators on them. They're pretty and they're great, and I like daisies, but they're not particularly good for pollinators. And then actually a plant I love to hate. My mum's got one of these outside her front door, and I've been rude about it for years. I don't like them particularly. And that particular type of hydrangea is really not very good at all for pollinators. There's other hydrangeas that are good, actually. It's not the whole family isn't great, but these mop-headed ones aren't great. What we're doing at the moment is working collaboratively with the RHS to come up with an evidence-informed list that they can get out to, you know, the public and all their members and things. So that's really quite exciting work going on at the moment. So moving on to the kind of last bit of the talk. So what can realistically be achieved in small spaces? So I'm going to go through 6 top tips for success with pollinators that you can implement in, it's kind of we know most about gardens actually, but these will work in parks as well. And one of them is specifically for parks actually. So let me take you through these 6 top tips. First of all, shrubs are fantastic. So have shrubs as the backbone of your kind of garden or park. In our study of 60 Bristol gardens, shrubs were the main life plant form providing nectar. So you can put plants into life forms. You've got herbs, you've got trees, you've got climbers, you've got shrubs, and so on. And shrubs are the kind of workhorses for nectar production. Not only that, they live for ages and they flower every year. So, you know, they're kind of low maintenance. So in my garden right now, the flowering currant is just about, well, it's just out actually. I can see it from where I'm sat right now. I can see the pink. Lavender is amazing. I don't normally, personally, I always have to take a double take as lavender as a shrub, but it's a woody shrub. If ever you trim it, it's obviously woody. So lavender as a shrub, things like caryopsis. And then again, in my garden, strawberry tree flowers right through to December. And that's where I'll see the last bumblebees of the year on my strawberry tree. So get shrubs in and get them in quickly, because they make a real difference. And once you've got them in and paid for them, you just you know, tend them a little bit and they'll deliver every single year. You don't have to grow them each year. So both parks and gardens, shrubs are fantastic, flowering shrubs, and go for that kind of phenology as well. So the flowering currant is flowering right now, and the strawberry tree will be flowering in December. Have something in flower every month of the year in the form of a shrub, ideally. Number 2 is one to avoid or minimize the use of what are called double flowered. So this is columbine, which is an extraordinarily pretty wild plant that I grow in my own garden. It's just a gorgeous plant anyway. It's a native plant and it's really good for pollinators in kind of May and early June. But there are domestic varieties of it. There's one called Norabalo, where it's just got multiple petals. It's actually exactly the same species, but it just looks a bit different. And there's no nectar in this. You know, the nectar has been lost. They've been turned into petals. And so there's a little bit of pollen, but this isn't a good plant for pollinators at all. So sticking with the simple forms, the original forms, is the best thing you can do for pollinators. And some other examples are things like roses. You know, I actually really like the old-fashioned roses, and there's nothing wrong with those, but just make sure that you've got some open ones that pollinators can access. If you can't see the anthers, then the pollinators can't either in flowers this sort of size and shape. And the same with dahlias. The dahlia I grow is Bishop of Langdaff. It's absolutely, Bishop of Auckland rather. It's absolutely gorgeous, but a very open flower, and it's just covered in pollinators all summer long. So keep it simple. Have at least some simple flowers in your garden that pollinators can access. Top tip number 3, long flowering seasons can be really useful. There's some really good kind of workhorse plants in the garden. So something like Ericium, the Bowles Mauve, which is what this one is here, that flowers from, I don't know, about March, early March to, or certainly late March through to November. It's got simple open flowers that any pollinator can access, a long flowering season. And this will have a wide range of pollinators. The ones in my garden have the bees, they have hoverflies, they have moths and butterflies on it as well. So it's a really good plant that each individual flower doesn't give you much nectar, but the longevity of the fill season, of the flowering season, and the fact there's a lot of flowers on it make it really, really useful. So again, a few plants like these are really useful. 4, with pollinators, don't worry too much about whether it's native versus alien plants for pollinators, okay? So in urban areas, most nectar comes from non-native plants. Pollinators don't mind where their nectar comes from, whether it's a native plant or a plant from South Africa or Mexico or the United States or the Mediterranean. They're not that fussy. Herbivorous insects are actually. If you want caterpillars, butterfly caterpillars and things like that, you do need native plants. But that said, there's some gorgeous native flowering plants which you can include in your planting schemes, which will be really good for pollinators and also really good for the other native types of insects. So ones I grow, in addition to columbine, are things like Viper's bugloss, which is one of the most drop-dead gorgeous plants out there. Foxgloves, the bog standard wild type foxglove is absolutely gorgeous. Cornflowers are just the prettiest things out there. And bloody cranesbill grows in, it grows in, I saw it growing on the lizard in the summer actually as a wild plant, but it grows in my garden too. And it's a long flowering season. It flowers sporadically throughout the year after a big burst in June, but they're all really pretty native plants you can grow and just mix in with your kind of garden centre plants. Top tip number 5, solitary bees nests. They work, and I've just put eventually in there because it took me 2-3 years to get mine working. So I bought one and not much really happened. And then you just got to move it around. They're picky on where the exact location of them. But I now have hundreds and hundreds of solitary bees in my solitary bee nests, and they also build up over the years. And it's just a huge amount of fun sat there with a cup of tea or a glass of wine, just watching your solitary bees buzzing backwards and forwards. And you can go for kind of, ones like the Ritz, or simple ones made out of baked bean cans or plastic bottles and rolled up paper. There's one for every budget and every interest out there. And they are a tremendous amount of fun, and they make, they work, they provide homes for bees. And then this one is actually particularly relevant to parks, actually. Mowing. Be kind to dandelions is one of the things the sayings we developed on the project. So this garden here is not particularly it's not pollinator friendly at all. There's nothing flowering there. Let weeds grow in your lawn. It doesn't need to be kind of boring and stripy. Cultivate just let a few plants flower in your lawns. On the Urban Pollinators project, we did some quite complicated modelling, and we actually showed that if you reduce the mowing frequency in parks, and what that does is it adds daisies, dandelions and clovers because they're there anyway, but they can't flower if you keep on mowing them. So reducing mowing increases those plants, and actually it decreases the risk of pollinator extinctions in the models of pollinator communities in the 4 cities. So it adds a lot of floral resources to a city, mowing less. And nobody likes mowing. It's far more fun to sit there with your cup of tea or glass of Chardonnay and watch the grass grow. And we've done quite a lot about this in the press. So this is just Googling, we managed to get things into Country Living, the Daily Mail. There's a Spring Watch blog from last year and so on. So just trying to get this message out there. Dandelions are very cool plants. Let your lawns grow ankle deep so bees can feast on their nectar. Dandelions, if they were rare, we'd be fighting over them. They're pretty, and I personally encourage them. And actually, the Memmott lawn, like they're just sat by the window here. But what we've been doing this last kind of 3 months is our lawn is just another kind of, it's a growing opportunity. It's not about the grass. So in January, the cyclamens start coming up, then the snowdrops, crocuses, and at the moment we've got anemones and primroses all over the place. So by having flowering in the lawn, you actually get another flower bed. Right, getting to the end. So what I've done is I've told you about the Urban Pollinators project, which is the scientific backdrop to all the advice we're able to give. I've given you an overview of research that isn't focusing on meadows, it's all sorts of other stuff. An overview of some of the recommended plant species and the fact they're really good for pollinators. There's some really easy wins. Put, shrubs and avoid double flowers. That will get you a long way. And then some ideas of what you can actually do in these small spaces. And then just to end, just some projects that are running at the moment. So there's normally a single big project running with multiple collaborators in the group. And the Urban Pollinators project has actually just swapped to one running in Nepal. And what we're doing there is looking at the relationship between climate change and pollinators and how this affects crop production and thereby micronutrient intake by people. So we're going from pollinators to people. So things like vitamin A and folic acid in developing countries comes predominantly from insect pollinated crops. And so this is going right through to the human health side of things. And then the big project starting up close to home is we're starting to look at pollen. We've done lots of work on nectar, but pollen is where the protein and the fats and the food that pollinators need for growing larvae comes from. And it's much harder to work on than nectar. This is a electron micrograph of red campion pollen. Pollen grains are fantastic. They're like alien spaceships under the scanning electron microscope. And we're going to be asking about how much pollen is produced in the UK and how it's changed since the 1950s. And it is pretty magical stuff. These are all sorts of pollen grains on a stigma of water mint, actually. The spiky ones are anything in the daisy family and so on. And they are, when you look at gazillions of pollen grains down the microscope, you eventually find one that sat there smiling back at you. That was a ribwort plantain pollen grain, actually. Right, if you want to find any further reading, my favourite pollinator book, the book that turned me into a pollination biologist, before that I worked on herbivores and parasitoids and all sorts of things, is The Forgotten Pollinators by Butchman and Nabham. American authors, so it's got hummingbirds and bats in as well, but it's a fantastic read and it's designed for the general public. And then of course here in the UK, there's a whole suite of kind of ones on British gardens and things. So look at some of the stuff by Dave Goulson. And then finally, just this is a shot from the Urban Pollinators projects on the mean streets of Bristol, out there sampling plants and pollinators and talking to the general public. And thank you for listening. And on that note, I'll stop sharing and go back to my other screen if I can find it.
Thank you, Jane.
There we go.
Thank you so much. That was an incredibly rich presentation and you put things across really clearly in terms of the research. And what struck me was that you showed us what a huge opportunity we have in parks to increase the number and variety of pollinators and to also create more nectar in our cities. You know, that's a big sort of goal for us, isn't it, to try and work towards?
Yeah, it is a win-win thing because actually there's pollinators and people like the same sort of things. We like flower-rich habitats by and large. It's quite good for human well-being. So there are, again, opportunities to have parks nicer places for people as well. I mean, they're nice now, but we can make them even nicer. So
absolutely. Great. We've got a little bit of time for questions. And we have a question from Susan Acton Campbell, and it's about summer flowering. Let me see if I can read the gist of it, which is to say that Susan says here, we have lots of spring flowering plants, lungwort, woundwort, white dead nettle, primrose, cowslips, lavender, etc., but not much that is flowering in full summer. What else could we grow to support more invertebrates and provide more pollen? The soil where Susan lives is Troopers Hill Nature Reserve in St George, and it's slightly acidic.
Yeah, no, I know Troopers.
Recommendations.
Well. Yeah. You'd be looking at wild plants, probably. I'd need to think about that one, just coming up with things off the top of off the cuff for
Sure.
I mean, the other thing to think about is that so Troopers Hill is the most amazing little oasis in the middle of a heavily built up area. So pollinators will commute in and out to local gardens as well. So the gardens will provide a rich source of nectar. You've got acidic grassland, so up there you've got a whole bunch of little yellow composites in the grass. What you might be able to get some of the, I need to look and see what sort of soil thymes need, those sorts of creeping flowers. Send me an email and I'll have things. So for garden plants, there's a whole suite of things. And actually something you can do if you've got a grassy habitat, if you mow your grass at different times, you'll end up with things flowering at different times. You know, the way in the Chelsea flower show, you get the Chelsea shop. If you take the flowers off, they will then flower again a few weeks later. So rather than actually doing a global mow on anything, just mow things at different times. And the same with things like lavender. If you deadhead things, they will bring another batch forth. So just a systematic way of kind of taking some flowers out so they will produce food later on can help as well. But there is in Britain, there's a thing called the June gap in our native plants. So there is a genuine gap between the spring flowering things, all the woodland plants and hedgerow plants, and the summer plants. And that's known as the June gap. And that actually does, it genuinely exists out there in our native flora. So plants actually, pollinators have to bridge that gap. So, in urban gardens, we're not as at the mercy of our native plants so much, so we can actually fill that gap a little bit more easily. But it is tricky in natural habitats.
That's great, and thank you for the invitation to Susan to get in touch with you directly. One of the questions that's come up on a slightly different subject is about lockdown. Do we know what happened over lockdown? Obviously, one of the silver linings of the crisis was that less of us were out in our cars, and we really noticed that nature was recovering. Do we actually have any research that looked at that, and do we know the effect on pollinators?
Not so much about pollinators, but there's been a Europe-wide study where they use these little recorders they're called audio moths. They're not moths, they're little electronic widgets that record sound. And then you can use some quite complicated software to tell you what species are in there. So there's really good software for birds and bats and things like that. And so across Europe with the lockdown, they actually showed that wildlife was kind of, was more active in cities. So we know a little bit about things like that. But pollinators, I'm not sure lockdown, pollinators I think are certainly more appreciated because more of us have had, my bees were never so well watched as they were last spring, just the wild pollinators in the garden because, between Zoom calls, I go and trot up and down the garden path, just to keep me sane. And lots of people are doing that and spending more quality time looking at things. So I don't think it would have made that much of a difference to pollinators per se, but I think it's got people a lot more interested in green spaces and their own gardens and what they can do. And I think that's actually further down the road. I think that's good for both people and pollinators, actually.
Great. And presumably, if more of us opt not to drive places and walk and cycle, that's got to be good news, hasn't it?
It has, yeah, no. And actually, I mean, in terms of climate change, the project we're working on in Nepal is climate change, but actually climate change is happening here in the UK. It's happening everywhere. It's a global phenomenon. So, if you look and see the sort of behavioural changes that are needed. So I think, the world won't just go back to the way it was, I think. Certainly academics and business people won't travel as much as we used to because we can see you just do it on Zoom. Instead, it's say that sort of change will be good for the health of the planet. I mean, the slightly depressing figures, I think the amount of change that we've seen during the lockdown is less than the actual change we need to kind of keep climate change where it needs to be. But humans are very ingenious. I'm a cup half full sort of person. We'll find a way. But I do think there are some win-wins out there. I think working from home will become more normal in the way it wasn't. And most people might do it a couple of days a week. And if you work, translate that into a couple of days a week less commuting at the scale of the whole country, and that is good for the environment and family time and things like that as well. Yeah,
and parks and gardens will become even more important, won't they, if we're working from home?
Yeah, no, and I'd like to see, I do think, parks have not been well, just because of austerity and all sorts of things, but it's a tremendous investment, investing in parks. Not everybody has a garden. I've certainly lived in places without gardens before, and, it is a luxury to have a garden, and everybody everybody should have access to green space wherever you live. If you live in a flat, you should have a good park nearby where you can go with the kids. And just go and sit under a bench, under a tree. It is tremendously good. You can feel your blood pressure going right down. So I do think, and there's lots of evidence to show that that actually can save money in terms of, you know, physical and mental health. You know, there's less health problems if there's green space around. In Leipzig in Germany, there was a study just published this year which showed that prescriptions for antidepressants were less if you lived within 100 meters of a big tree. And actually that effect was even stronger in poorer areas, so, you know, in deprived areas. So just having, you know, decent trees and green space in cities makes people feel better. And it's, a, you know, it's a statistically significant effect that leads to less antidepressants being prescribed in that city. So yeah,
Sure.
an investment, it really is.
Sure. And you talked about some of the underused spaces, so the sort of verges and patches of ground that aren't always recognised as being suitable for growing. Do you have any examples of some city projects that have done that?
Well, yeah, I think there's one going on, I went to Charlie, which is around somewhere, but there's one Bristol City Council, there's this stuff been done on around the back of College Green and things like that. And I mean, I walk past the church in Clifton every day, and it's got this boring bit of green stuff outside of it that's beautifully clipped, but, you know, I'm just, you know, put some flower, you know, even just putting some spring flowering bulbs in there, it'll, you know, there are lots of these little areas of land. And the only management they tend to get is a really regular mowing regime, which is expensive. So in the middle of the university campus behind physics, there was one of these boring bits of green turf. It was mowed 11 times a year, and we turned that into a wildflower meadow. People loved it. It's absolutely gorgeous, and it's cheaper to maintain as a meadow. This is an annual mix, so it's the most expensive sort of meadow, than to actually the cost of mowing it 11 times a year, the cost of the labour, the cost of the machinery, the cost of getting rid of the clippings. So it can be actually save money to do it in a much more interesting way. So there's loads of opportunities out there. And I think we just all need to kind of, you know, bang on some doors and just ask people, why don't they do something more interesting? Because it's not that difficult to you know, and it just needs a penny to drop to realise. And all those little areas, other green space is about a quarter of the city. So if we were to transform that, you know, and the messages at the university we got and our flowering meadows and urban pollinators, people love walking by those areas. It just makes you feel better. And it's good for really good for pollinators as well. So there's a tremendous opportunity there.
Great. Yeah, thanks for your encouragement. We're really inspired to be working in partnership with Bristol Cathedral.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
Trust and other organisations, yes, to be rewilding that area of College Green by the cathedral.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And I actually walk past that. Well, once I'm back in at work, I walk past that every day. So I'm particularly excited for things on, you know, on my way to get the bus in the evening. So yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it's a really nice legacy as well of Greta Thunberg's visit last year.
Yeah, it's a perfect legacy actually, because it did get a bit trampled, the area, and so turning it into something that's, you know, much better for wildlife is just perfect.
That's right. So yes, we're looking forward to making a lot more people happy that walk alongside that area. And it was interesting what you mentioned in your presentation about volunteering and how volunteers are happier and full of vigour.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what vigor actually is. Difference, how they define vigor, but it definitely, there's a lot of evidence now that actually shows, and it's that kind of, you're part of something, that's social capital, you're part of a team, you've got kind of the social contact, you've got the practical exercise, you've got the physical exercise, so it's good for both physical and mental well-being, volunteering. And it's a tremendous resource out there that we've got, and you know, and when it's good for both halves, we should all do more of it, basically. So yeah.
Great. We've got another question, actually. Again, it's Troopers Hill related. Susan says that we're getting more trampling on our local nature reserve due to the higher footfall because of COVID.
Yeah.
So, yes, Susan's saying her theory is the newly created desire line paths might help. That sounds
yeah. Actually, it's the second time I've heard that. There are a lot more people out there in the countryside, and actually, for a long time, all sorts of organisations have been trying to get people out into nature reserves, and there's now possibly, you know, sometimes feels like there's too many, but to me, actually getting more people out is a good thing. And actually, bare ground, there are a whole bunch of invertebrates that like bare ground, particularly the ground nesting bees, and it'll bounce back, to be honest. So I haven't been to Troopers Hill this year yet, but I'm sure it'll be fine. But I do think the more people, natural history and enjoying the natural world shouldn't just be a sport for the lucky few. Everybody should be able to do it. And if you look at the Dasgupta review, you know, the idea of actually teaching kids natural history in schools, to me, it's something that everybody should get to enjoy. And we should all have that bit of green space to walk through on your way back from school or from work or something. So I view it as a kind of a good problem in some ways.
Sure. And some of the flower species you mentioned have sort of fabulous names to conjure with. Anne is asking, would you mind just recapping on some of the different flowers?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm trying to think. So the wild ones. So in terms of the wild ones that I grow in my garden, Viper's bugloss, which is a fantastic name. I've got no idea. I'd have to Google it to find out why it's called Viper's bugloss. Anyway, it is a beautiful name. It's a beautiful plant. Very easy to grow from seed. Columbine, Aquilegia vulgaris. So it's a wood. Actually, it's supposed to be a woodland edge plant. In my place, it grows on a hot gravel drive for some reason, and it self seeds there. But that's really good for pollinators. Foxglove, just wild foxglove is a beautiful plant, actually. Put it in a shady area and if it likes you, it'll stay with you forever. I'm trying to remember what else was in that slide. My mind's gone blank. In the lawn, we've got things, well, there's a mixture of, it starts with the winter flowering cyclamen, which are a Mediterranean bulb, actually, and they just come up every single year. And then we've got this lovely progression. So you get the cyclamen first and the snowdrops, then the crocuses, and then we've got anemones naturalizing now, and the primrose is coming through. So yeah, I mean, there's plenty of resources online with kind of wildflowers, and just learning to me, I'm just learning the common names of wildflowers. Don't worry about the Latin binomials. Start with the common names because they're much easier to remember. Once you know something's name, it kind of becomes a friend almost. You know, you recognize it again and again. And I'm one of these people that, you know, if you're stuck in a traffic jam or walking along the pavement, my brain is constantly just clocking all the plant species as I go along. And it's just really fun. I'm never bored. So, but yeah, there are some names out there, though. Yeah. And
hopefully the RHS may be updating their list, do you think?
We are working collaboratively with them. We've had a PhD student, Nick Chu, who's done an amazing job of work. He did the Bristol Garden study, and we looked at the nectar value of over 500 plant species, because there was a reasonable amount known about the wild plants, but doing there's thousands and thousands of garden plants out there, but we've done the common ones, basically. So, and that data is the evidence base that we'll get, that the RHS will be using. So they're working collaboratively with us on that project. So, and they're great because the RHS, I've been a member of the RHS since that very first garden. I showed you that little tiny terrace back garden, and, they've got thousands of members. So it's a way of actually getting the information. You know, we put stuff into scientific journals, but not many people read scientific journals. But if you get it into the garden magazine, the RHS journal, then your readership is way, way higher. So it's really good. The RHS are great. They're
their website's great as well, isn't it?
Yeah, no, they know their stuff. Yeah,
communicating to a wider audience.
Yeah,
and there are a couple of books you mentioned as sort of
books. Yeah, the Forgotten Pollinators by Steve Butchman and Gary Paul Nabham. That was the book that I read it on holidays in the Picos d'Europa. I was pregnant.